Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon. I am Wilmer Leon, and this is a special episode. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they occur in a vacuum, and we're failing to understand the broader historical context in which many of these events occur. During each episode, usually my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they occur. And this enables you to better understand and analyze the events that impact the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is what's really behind this most recent spate of military spending, and is democracy really at risk? My guest for this discussion is me. As the brilliant philosopher, the late Maurice White with Earth, Wind, and Fire said in All About Love, I want to take this moment to run down a couple of things about things we see every day. So in this episode, it's just going to be you and I. President Joe Biden on Wednesday, the 24th of April, he signed into law the so-called military aid package. It's worth $95 billion of your hard-earned tax dollars. It includes nearly $61 billion that's going to Ukraine, $26 billion for Israel, and $8 billion for the Indio Pacific. After signing the bill, President Biden said, quote, it's a good day for America, it's a good day for Ukraine, it's a good day for world peace. The aid package, Biden said, is going to make America safer. It's going to make the world safer, and it continues America's leadership in the world. Is it, and does it really? Well, so these statements by Biden, they're going to be kind of the broad outline of my comments for today. What's really behind all of this money to Ukraine, Israel, and the Indio Pacific? And is it an investment in safety, or is it profit for the military industry? On January 17th, 1961, in his farewell address to the nation, President Dwight Eisenhower, a former general and Republican, warned the country and the world against the establishment of what he called the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower said, and I quote, "A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be might, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction." He was talking about a defensive military, not an offensive military. He went on to say, American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But now we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. And this is really the key. This conjunction, this is Eisenhower, of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. Yet, we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. I repeat that. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. And that's what we see today. Eisenhower was incredibly prophetic in his concern of the dangers of American foreign policy becoming the idle ideological plaything of the arms industry. So coming out of World War II in 1945, coming out of the Korean conflict in 1953, and entering the Vietnam conflict around 1955 or 1956, it's very easy to understand Eisenhower's position on the need for a strong and prepared military. We're not going to debate that point. That could be a whole nother program. But with that, he admonished us not to fail to comprehend the grave implications the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. So again, what's really behind all of this money to Ukraine, all this money to Israel, all this money to the Indio Pacific? Let's start with Ukraine. And most of this will center around Ukraine because that's where a bulk of the money is going. And that's also where, for the most part, the most immediate risk of conflagration exists. There's a great piece that's published in the Libertarian Institute. It's entitled, "To End the War in Ukraine, Expose Its Core Lie." To end the war in Ukraine, expose its core lie. It's co-authored by Ted Snyder, a regular columnist on U.S. foreign policy with at anti-war and history at antiwar.com, as well as the Libertarian Institute. And it's co-authored by Professor Nikolai Petro. He's a political scientist at the University of Rhode Island, and he's also the author of a number of books. And since their piece is so well researched and so well written, I'm just going to quote from it instead of trying to reinvent the wheel. They did a phenomenal job with this piece, and I suggest everybody read it. Anyway, they write, "The essential argument used to avoid negotiation and continue support for the war in Ukraine is based upon a falsehood." They call it a falsehood. I call it a lie. That falsehood, repeated by Joe Biden, is that when Russian President Putin decided to invade Ukraine, he intended to conquer all of Ukraine and annihilate it. Its falsity, and this is Snyder and Petro, its falsity has been exposed multiple times by military experts who have pointed out both before and after the invasion that Russia could not have intended to conquer all of Ukraine because it did not invade with sufficient forces to do so. Indeed, this was the key reason why senior Ukrainian officials and even President Zelensky himself argued just days before the invasion it would not occur. Now, I take issue with their use of the word invasion because it's really a military intervention, but again, that's a discussion for another time. Folks, if you just strip away the rhetoric and the lies, and if you just look at the facts, the U.S. started this fight with Russia and is using Ukraine as its proxy to do so. Snyder and Petro also have a piece. It's a shorter version of the piece that I just referenced, and it's entitled 4 Myths That Are Preventing Peace in Ukraine. Again, their work is so well researched and written, I'm just going to quote them. Again, I'm not going to try to reinvent the wheel. They write, "If diplomacy is to have a chance at settling the bloody conflict, then 4 persistent myths about Ukraine need to be exposed and refuted. Myth number 1, myth number 1, if Putin is not defeated in Ukraine, he will roll into Europe." You've heard this many times. Quote, "If Putin takes Ukraine," according to President Biden, he said this in Congress on the 6th of December, 2023, "he won't stop there. He's going to keep going. He's made that pretty clear." End quote. The problem with that statement is no evidence to support it has ever been presented. Petro and Snyder continue, But Putin has not made that pretty clear. In fact, Putin has consistently said that, quote, the Ukraine crisis is not a territorial conflict. The issue is much broader and more fundamental and is about the principles of underlying the new international order, end quote. Simply put, it's about President Putin being concerned about Russian territorial security, sovereignty, and integrity in the same manner that any other leader in the world is concerned about their territorial security, sovereignty, and integrity. He's not doing anything different than what any other world leader would do. There's a piece at NatoWatch.com, I think, .org, NatoWatch.org, entitled How Gorbachev Was Misled Over Assurances Against NATO Expansion. And this piece that I'm referencing is kind of background to give you some greater context about what Snyder and Petro have written. The U.S. was trying to convince the Soviet Union, this is back in the 90s, was trying to convince the Soviet Union to allow for the reunification of East and West Germany. The then U.S. Secretary of State James Baker, his famous not 1 inch eastward assurance about NATO expansion, while he was meeting with then the president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, this was on February 9th, 1990, was only a part of a cascade of similar assurances, meaning not only did James Baker say it, but other European leaders said this to Gorbachev as well. In February of 1990, Baker assured the Soviet Union, and at the time he was the U.S. Secretary of State under then President George H.W. Bush, he assured his counterpart, Edward Shevardnadze, that in a post-Cold War Europe, NATO would no longer be belligerent, quote, less of a military organization, much more of a political one, and that it would have no need for an independent capability. This is what the United States told the Soviet Union. Nonetheless, Baker promised Shevardnadze, quote, ironclad guarantees that NATO's jurisdiction of forces would not move eastward, meaning no closer to the then Soviet Union. On the same day in Moscow, he famously told the Secretary General that the alliance would not move, quote, 1 inch to the east. The following day, Helmut Kohl, the future chancellor of a united Germany, repeated the same thought to Gorbachev. Even though they were disagreeing on other issues, Helmut Kohl told Gorbachev not 1 inch eastward. That's what convinced Gorbachev to agree to the reunification of East and West Germany. I believe France, Britain, and possibly 1 or 2 other European countries made the same assurances as well. And again, as a result of these assurances, Germany was reunited. The West, NATO, and Western allies, or U.S. allies, have violated this agreement ever since. That's what's at the crux of the conflict. That's why when President Putin and President Biden met in Geneva, Switzerland, before the Russian intervention, Putin told Biden, I'm giving you my security concerns in writing, and I expect your response to my concerns to come back to me in writing. He demanded the written response because Baker had stated the commitment verbally to Gorbachev. So now Putin wants this in writing. And just quickly, to those that say, oh, well, because it was just a statement and it was not written, it's not valid. Nay, nay, I say to you. There's a case, I think it's Norway versus Greenland. It's a 1935, 1936 international law case that holds statements made by official representatives of states or countries are valid. They are enforceable. So the fact that Baker said it and didn't write it does not mean it's not valid. Again, according to Norway v. Greenland, it's a 1935, 1936 international case. Okay, with that, now let's go back to Petro. Myth number 2. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was never about NATO. That's the myth, that this has not, the conflict in Ukraine has nothing to do with NATO. Western officials insist that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was unprovoked, and that Russia's decision to illegally invade Ukraine was never about NATO expansion and crossing Russia's red lines, but rather it's a senseless war against a sovereign, freedom-loving nation. Petro and Snyder continue. On the 7th of September of 2023, NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg made the stunning admission that Putin's decision to invade Ukraine was indeed provoked by NATO encroachment on Ukraine. The United States wanted to put missiles into Ukraine, too close to the Russian border. Prior to making that decision to go into Ukraine, Stoltenberg said that Putin had, quote, sent a draft treaty that they wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent to us, Stoltenberg said, and was a precondition for his not invading Ukraine. And Stoltenberg said, of course, we didn't sign that. Myth number 3. The war in Ukraine is a war on democracy versus autocracy. According to this narrative, Russia cannot be allowed to win because this war is not just about Ukraine, it's the first battlefield in a larger war for democracy against autocracy. But Russia abandoned the goal of exporting ideology when the Soviet Union collapsed. In fact, the Russian Constitution, Article 13 of the Russian Constitution, explicitly prohibits the imposition of a single state ideology and the exportation of such. And for those of you who will say, oh, well, you all didn't know, Russia has a constitution. President Putin is bound by that constitution. Russia has a parliament. They have a democracy. Vladimir Putin, contrary to popular belief and narrative, is not an autocrat. He's no more of an autocrat than Joe Biden is an autocrat. And some would tell you that Joe Biden is an autocrat. But anyway, this is my input. If the U.S. is spending billions of your taxpayer dollars to defend democracy, then why did the United States go in and overthrow the democratically elected government of President Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine in 2014? To that point, there's a piece in Truthout, the Ukraine mess that Nuland made. You can find this in Truthout, the Ukraine mess that Nuland made. Assistant Secretary of State at the time, Victoria Nuland, engineered Ukraine's regime change without weighing its likely consequences. This is by Robert Parry, Parry. Quote, as the Ukrainian army squares off against ultra-right and neo-Nazi militias in the West, and violence against ethnic Russians continues in the East, the obvious folly of the Obama administration's Ukraine policy has come into focus, even for many who tried to ignore the facts, or what many have called the mess that Victoria Nuland made. Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Toria Nuland, was the mastermind behind the February 22nd, 2014 regime change in Ukraine, plotting the overthrow of the democratically elected government of President Viktor Yanukovych while convincing the ever gullible U.S. mainstream media that the coup wasn't really a coup, but a victory for democracy. Folks, she worked with Nazis in Ukraine to overthrow the democratically elected Yanukovych government in 2014. It's called the Maidan coup or Maidan coup. Look it up. Maidon. Everything I'm telling you right now, you can verify for yourselves. In fact, I implore you to do so. I'm not just taking this stuff off the top of my head. This is not my opinion. If it is my opinion, I will tell you that it is. This is historic fact. Myth number 4. Putin, again, this is Snyder and Petro. Putin is not interested in negotiating. The West insists that Putin is not interested in negotiating an end to this conflict, despite multiple news reports that he has been signaling through intermediaries that he is open to a ceasefire and that he is ready to make a deal. The White House continues to insist that he has shown absolutely no indication he's willing to negotiate. And that's just not true. My opinion. That's just not, well, that's a fact. He, my opinion, is not interested in negotiating based upon the usual tactic that the United States uses. The United States' usual tactic of negotiation is capitulation. The United States comes to the table and says, here's how it's going to go. And once you agree to how we believe it's going to go, then we can sit down and talk about it. And Putin's saying, no, nay, I'm not going to do that. You want to negotiate this? We're going to sit down and negotiate this. And that's one of the big problems, my opinion again, that's one of the big problems that the United States has with dealing with a peer such as Russian President Putin. Back to Petro. But the historical record shows that Putin has sought a negotiated settlement since the opening days of the conflict. And by all accounts, Russia and Ukraine had even reached a tentative agreement in Istanbul in April of 2022. And that has been confirmed by American reporting, by then Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, by former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, by Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu, and Numan Kurtulmus. Sorry for that struggle with those names. He's the deputy chairman of Erdogan, Turkish President Erdogan's party. In fact, the former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, he went to Ukraine and told Zelensky in April of 22, under no circumstance is the West going to allow you to negotiate a settlement with Russia. I say that again. As the United States says that Russia has no interest in negotiating, they were already negotiating and they had reached an agreement. And there have been some instances, some press conferences where Putin has held up the agreement and said, I got it right here. But Bojo, Boris Johnson, went and told, on behalf of the West, went and told Zelensky, under no circumstances is the West going to back that play. So if Putin isn't interested in negotiating, why did he participate in the Minsk agreements? The series of international agreements which sought to end the Donbass conflict that was fought between armed Ukrainian pro-Russian separatist groups and the armed forces of Ukraine. Folks, look up the Minsk Accords. And when you look up the Minsk Accords, here's the problem. You can find this at the World Socialist website. You can find this a number of places. Former German Chancellor Angela Merkel admits that the Minsk Accords or the Minsk Agreement was merely to buy time for Ukraine's arms buildup. Quote, the 2024 Minsk Agreement was an attempt to give Ukraine time, Merkel told a German newspaper, Die Zeit. It was also used, they also used that time to become stronger, as you can see today. That and Angela Merkel was one of the key conveners of the Minsk meetings under the pretext of negotiating a settlement between what were called the ethnic Russians in the Donbass region and the rest of Ukraine. See, once you had the 2014 Maidan coup and the Yanukovych government was thrown out, then a pro-Ukrainian nationalist Western-leaning government backed by Nazis in Ukraine was implemented. And they then, because they were Ukrainian nationalists, they started ethnically cleansing what were called ethnic Russians in what's known as the Donbass region of Ukraine. And those folks in the Donbass were begging President Putin to intervene on their behalf. They're Ukrainian citizens with Russian background, Russian families. Many of them speak Russian. They are members of the Russian Orthodox Church. They travel back and forth between the Donbass and Russia because they have families in Russia. But the Ukrainian nationalists wanted to ethnically cleanse them from the country. And so in order to stop the conflict, they came to what was called the Minsk Accords, which is why, if you go back and look at the record, you'll see Putin telling Biden before he went into Ukraine, all you got to do is implement the Minsk Agreement and we're good. All you've got to do is implement the Minsk Agreement and I'm not going in. We've already negotiated this. All you have to do is implement it. And he told that to Biden when they were in Sweden, in Geneva. You can look it up. The United States ignored it. So folks, this is a cursory overview of the situation. You can research this for yourselves. Tony Blinken, Joe Biden, even Malcolm Nance, Lindsey Graham, Marco Rubio, they're all lying to you. This is not about defending democracy. It's not about stopping the further advance of Russia. It's all about selling weapons around the world. And they're using your nickel to do it. Of the $60.7 billion that's going to Ukraine, $38.8 billion isn't going to Ukraine. It's going to U.S. factories that make missiles, munitions, and other military gear. It's going to replenish the United States military stocks that have been depleted as a result of this fool's errand called Ukraine. It's going to Lockheed Martin. It's going to General Dynamics. It's going to General Electric. It's going to Boeing. It's going to Raytheon. It's going to a whole lot of other American arms manufacturers, or as Eisenhower referred to them, the military industrial complex. And I'm not making these numbers up. You can look it up. This came from an Associated Press story. And guess where the Associated Press got their numbers? They got their numbers from the Biden administration. So again, not my opinion. It's the facts. There's a great summary at the World Socialist website. It's and I referenced the story a little earlier in this piece. But if you're asking yourself, so what's the motivation behind the United States for using Ukraine as its proxy to confront Russia? The summary is as follows. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States has pursued the goal of remaining the sole world power. To this end, Washington has waged numerous criminal wars and expanded NATO into Eastern Europe. Now it wants to integrate Ukraine, Georgia, and other former Soviet republics into NATO and subjugate Russia in order to plunder its resources and isolate China. End quote. You may have heard the pivot towards China from the Obama administration. That's what this isolation of China is all about. It's a pivot away from Afghanistan, a pivot away from a conflict with Russia, and the focus is on China. So the $61 billion in aid to Ukraine, the $26 billion for Israel, the $8 billion for the Pacific, those are your tax dollars. With infrastructure crumbling in the United States, healthcare, pensions, education. We don't have the money to deal with those things. As the rate of suicide is up in the United States, as the rate of depression is up in the United States, as inflation is ravaging the pocketbooks of the middle class and the working class and the poor in this country, they got $95 billion of your tax dollars that they can send to Ukraine. Now, $26 billion for Israel. What a mess that is. Contrary to the dominant narrative, this conflict did not start on the 7th of October. In fact, there's a piece in the publication In These Times entitled, History Didn't Begin on October 7th. The Israeli military is currently carrying out an attack on the besieged Gaza Strip, bombing homes, bombing mosques, bombing hospitals, churches, cutting off access to water, assassinating children, assassinating doctors. They're cutting off electricity. They're cutting off food. The Palestinian death toll has risen to over 35,000. 70% of those 35,000 are women and children. 80% of Gaza's 2.3 million residents have been displaced. Gazans suffer untreated injuries and a continual lack of medical supplies. While this collective punishment, which, by the way, violates international law, has been justified by right-wingers, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant called Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip human animals. And U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham, the Republican from South Carolina that's never met a war he didn't like, called for the military to level the place. and a sitting American senator has called upon the Israeli government to level Gaza, which, by the way, is in violation of American law because Israel is using American money and American weapons to ethnically cleanse, to collectively punish, to engage in genocide against the Palestinian people. Look up the Leahy law, the Leahy Amendment. Look it up. Look up the Arms Export Control Act, and you'll see very clearly that the United States is in violation of its own law by providing weapons to Israel, while its Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, while its Defense Minister Gallant, and others have stated very clearly that they are engaging in genocide. Now, as I talk about this, and as I talk about what Hamas's response, Hezbollah's response in Lebanon, Ansar Allah in Yemen, I'm not saying this to condone violence or to condone killing. In no way, shape, or form. But you have to understand the context in which these actions and reactions are taking place. Dr. King told us many times that war is an enemy of the poor. And he also talked about the three evils of society are racism, militarism, and poverty. About racism, he said, if America does not respond creatively to the challenge to banish racism, some future historian will have to say that a great civilization died because it lacked the soul and commitment to make justice a reality for all men. That not only applies to how the United States government treats Native Americans, that not only applies to how the United States government treats Mexican and other Latino or Hispanic immigrants, that does not only apply to how the United States treats African Americans, it applies to how the United States sends and spends its money to back, fund, and organize genocide against the Palestinians. The second evil was militarism. And Dr. King said, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. $95 billion sent of our tax dollars to foreign countries for war, for oppression, to maintain this unitary or unilateral hegemony that the United States has become used to since World War II. And our bridges are collapsing. You have people in the United States that are having to decide between, do they pay their rent, do they pay their mortgage, or do they pay their grocery bill? And that takes us into the third element, the third evil of society that Dr. King talked about, poverty, where he says the poor, black and white, are still perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. What happens to a dream deferred? It leads to bewildering frustration and corroding bitterness. The people cry for freedom, and the Congress attempts to legislate repression. They just voted to send $95 billion of your tax dollars to oppress another people, repress another people. Dr. King, millions, yes, billions are appropriated for mass murder. It's not me, that's Dr. King, for mass murder. But the most meager pittance of foreign aid for international development is crushed in the surge of reaction. Unemployment rages at a major depression level in the Black ghettos. But the bipartisan response is an anti-riot bill rather than a serious poverty program. Or you've got Mike Johnson going to Columbia calling for the arrest of protesting students that are protesting what? They're not protesting against Judaism. They're not protesting against Israelis. They're protesting against genocide, and they're protesting for the freedom and the rights of Palestinians. At the time that he gave this speech, which I think was 1968, right before he died, $26 billion. I'm sorry, this is me now. My problem, my mistake. $26 billion of your tax dollars are being invested in the genocide of the Palestinian people. Context, folks, context is incredibly, incredibly important here. I'm not going to go through the 75 years of apartheid and oppression right now that's going on in Palestine. I'm not going to go through that right now. Let's just look at some of the most recent incidents. According to Chatham House, the Israeli attack on Iran's consulate in Damascus on the 1st of April, you remember? Israel sent missiles into Damascus, Syria, and struck the Iranian consulate in Damascus, killing an Iranian general and a number of other diplomats. That's unprecedented. That's an unprecedented escalation by Israel against Iran in Syria. An unprecedented escalation. Folks, it's a violation of international law for one country to attack the embassy or the consulate of another country. And they did it on Syrian soil, which means they also violated Syrian sovereignty. What did Iran do? After consultation with the United States and agreement with the United States, some say it was Bill Burns from the CIA, with the US and other countries in the region, and based upon and consistent with international law. That's a very, very important point here, is that after Israel on April 1st illegally struck the Iranian consulate in Syria, Iran did not just react in a knee-jerk manner. They didn't just send a barrage of missiles into Tel Aviv. They sat down and they spoke with the United States and they said, look, we can't allow this to stand. We just can't sit idly by anymore and let them do this to us. So here's what we're going to do. Based upon international law, we are allowed to retaliate. Rarely when you read about this in the newspaper does it say that Iran retaliated against Israel. How they usually describe it, and this is why context is important, they usually describe it as Iran struck Israel. Iran attacked Israel. No, they retaliated. And under international law, what you are allowed to do is you are allowed to strike military targets that were tied to the offensive strike that you endured. And you're also allowed, through international law, to strike support targets as well, such as radar towers, communication facilities. And so Iran sat down, I think it was Bill Burns from the CIA. And Bill Burns said to Iran, okay, so long as you don't hit civilian targets, we, the United States, will not respond. So what did Iran do? They retaliated, as international law allows them to. And when they finished, they even gave the United States and Israel the heads up. They said, in 5 hours, this is what we're going to do. And they used these slow-moving drones so that the United States and Israeli radar could track the drones. They even gave them time to get their newly acquired F-35 jet fighter planes that they had just gotten from the United States out of harm's way. They did all of that to make a point. And when they were finished, they said, we now consider the matter closed. You struck us, we retaliated, we're good. But Israel wasn't satisfied. And what did Israel do? They struck again in violation of international law. Fortunately, President Raisi, as well as Supreme Leader Khomeini and others in the Iranian government, fortunately, they are thoughtful. Fortunately, they have a longer view of history than Americans do. Fortunately, they exercised restraint, and they have not struck back. Think about that. Context, folks. Context is very important. President Biden tells us that we're protecting security and democracy in Israel. Here's a newsflash. There's nothing secure about Israel, and there's nothing democratic about a colony that oppresses over 30% of its population. Palestinians do not have the same rights to vote as Israelis do. Palestinians do not have the same right to travel throughout the country as Israelis do. Many Palestinians have been relegated to living in an open-air concentration camp called the Gaza Strip, where their caloric intake is monitored and managed by the Israeli government. Their access to water, their access to electricity is managed by the Israeli government. That's not democracy. That's not even humanity. It's called genocide. And your tax dollars are being used to fund it. There's nothing democratic about a United States that is arresting students for peacefully protesting against genocide. Now, over 40 colleges and universities are engaged in protests. The University of Southern California in Los Angeles has canceled graduation. They are not allowing, well, the first thing they did was they decided that the valedictorian of the class of 2024, a Palestinian American woman, was not going to be allowed to give her valedictorian address. And then after they claim due to security concerns. So instead of protecting her and allowing her to give her speech, they have been held hostage by threat, by innuendo, by social media posts. Think about that. Over 40 colleges and universities are now engaged in protests. And presidents of these universities are calling out the police. They're arresting students. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, just went to Columbia University and threatened or called for the resignation of the president because of Columbia, because she's not following the script. And to show you how prevalent this has become, there are now high school students in Washington, D.C. at Jackson Reed High School, the largest high school in the District of Columbia. They have had to file a lawsuit being represented by the ACLU. They have filed a lawsuit against their principal, saying that the principal has infringed upon their First Amendment rights by barring them from holding pro-Palestinian events and distributing information materials. So apparently, the First Amendment doesn't apply if your speech is in support of those that the Israeli lobby deems to be offensive. And for those of you listening to this that say that this is an anti-Semitic analysis, no, it's not. It's anti-Zionist is what it is. And contrary to what they have now wanted to say from Congress and what many backing the Israeli lobby will tell you, Zionism and Judaism are not the same thing. Look it up. Don't take my word for it. Zionism is a political ideology that is racist, that is white supremacist, and is used as the basis for genocide against the Palestinians, whereas Judaism is a religious belief system. Two totally different things. Finally, what the United States loves to call the Indio Pacific. Basically, what they're doing is trying to start a war with China. And they're using the island of Taiwan, as the United States has used Ukraine as its proxy to start a war with Russia. The United States is using the island of Taiwan in a similar manner. And fortunately, President Xi of China is thoughtful, patient, reserved, and is not responding to the provocations as the United States would do if China were trying to do to Puerto Rico, or trying to do through Puerto Rico what the United States is trying to do to China through Taiwan. Whew. Missiles would be flying and bullets would be shot. But Xi is a wise man. And he's not falling for the banana in the tailpipe trick. He's not going to allow the United States to provoke his country into a conflict. So the United States is engaging in military exercises with South Korea. The United States is engaged in military exercises with Japan. The United States is engaged in military exercises with the Philippines. The United States is building more military bases along the Pacific Rim. All of this, and heaven knows why, because it's a fight the U.S. can't win. We don't have the technology. We don't have the technology that they have. We don't have the capacity, the capability, the hypersonic missiles. Look, the United States, going back to the the Gaza conflict, the United States sends in the USS Eisenhower, or was it Gerald Ford? I think it was the Gerald Ford. They send in the Gerald Ford carrier group into the Mediterranean off the coast of Israel. And President Putin says to Biden, he says, Why are you doing this? He says, you're not scaring anybody. These people don't scare. He says, oh, by the way, we, Russia, can sink your aircraft carrier from here with hypersonic missiles. Hypersonic missiles. These things fly at something like 9 times, 10 times the speed of sound. They have, I think it's the Su-35, which is a fighter jet that Russia has, and they're called Kinjal. I think it's Kinjal. Kinjal missiles. Look it up. They can sink the carrier from the Black Sea before the carrier even recognizes that the missiles are incoming. That thing is on its way. That carrier is on its way to the bottom of the Mediterranean before they even know that the missiles are incoming. And China has the technology as well. Some say that Iran has the technology. So, folks, why? Why are your tax dollars being used, being wasted, when there is such drastic need at home? And this is not a Republican or a Democratic issue. This is a neocon, and you got Republican and Democratic neocons. This is a neocon issue. They are lying to you about the rationales and the so-called logic that they are employing so that it's a money laundering scheme, is what it is. The United States, through its proxy Ukraine, starts a conflict with Russia so that the Biden administration can tell you that we have to increase our military spending to stop the fight with Russia, to stop the war in Ukraine, to defend the Ukrainians. Well, if you hadn't started the fight in the first place, there wouldn't be a fight. Joe Biden tells us we have to defend security and democracy in Israel. As the United States arms, funds, trains, provides logistic support to the Israeli government as it engages in genocide against the Palestinians. It's very simple, Joe. If you want to bring a stop to this, as you wring your hands and cry crocodile tears about protecting innocent Palestinian civilians, pick up the phone, tell Benjamin Netanyahu you don't get another damn dime. Very simple. Very simple. The way you end the fight is don't start the fight in the first place. The United States is trying to provoke a war with China over Taiwan, even though it is clearly stated, articulated by then President Nixon, Secretary of State Kissinger, the one China policy. The United States considers Taiwan to be a part of China. The UN recognizes Taiwan is a part of China. The majority of Taiwanese believe, support that they are Chinese citizens. If you don't want to have a fight with China, then don't provoke the fight with China. As they say on the corner, don't start nothing, Won't be nothing. So, folks, here's what you really need to think about. What does this mean? I just went through Ukraine. I just went through Israel. I just went through the conflict with China. And what does this mean? What's at stake? Well, first of all, World War III. Remember, Russia is a nuclear-armed country. China, I believe, has nuclear weapons. Israel, that's the worst kept secret in the world, is a nuclear-armed country. So the United States, as a nuclear power, is trying to start a conflict with other nuclear powers. A nuclear war is unwinnable by anybody. Everybody loses in the course of a nuclear war. Even if the war doesn't go nuclear, look at all the resources that have been wasted that could have been used to make America truly safer. When our infrastructure is sound, the country is safer. When our children are better educated, our country is safer. When you have social security, our country is safer. Why can't we have the health care, the mental health care, the family care that this $95 billion, and that's just the most recent of the so-called aid bills. That's just the most recent of them, 95 billion. Where could that money go? And what could that money do to help you, to make your life easier, to ensure a better standard of living for you? What could be done with that money instead of being used to fund a fight that the United States started? Again, don't start nothing, won't be nothing. But when militarism is all you have, what is the adage? When your only solution is a hammer, every problem is a nail. When militarism is your problem, is your solution, every problem is a conflict. And oh, by the way, you're starting the conflict. So, folks, in all the stuff that I've said over this past hour, have you heard that on MSNBC? Have you heard that on CNN? Have you heard that on Fox News? Probably not. But when you do a little research, you'll find everything I've said to you is true. The truth is the light. So again, this is on you because this is impacting you. And you've got to start at the local level, starting with your city council, starting with your state and local government, and working its way up. You've got to look at what those kids are doing on college campuses and on high school campuses now. They are getting engaged. Now, I'm not saying you got to pitch a tent on somebody's lawn, and no, there are a myriad of ways that you can re-engage in the process. But it starts with reading. So with that, I say to you, I got to thank my guest, who, by the way, is me. Thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. Stay tuned for new episodes every week. Also, please follow and subscribe. Go to patreon.com/Wilmer Leon and contribute. Please contribute. It costs to produce this program every week. We could do more programs in the week if we had the funding to do so. So please contribute. Go to patreon.com/Wilmer Leon. Leave a review, share the show, follow us on social media. You can find all the links below in the show description. And remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, history converge. Talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See you again next time. Until then, I'm Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a great one. Peace.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.